Sup investors, it's the Russian dude. Over the last 24 hours, Russia launched almost 400 long-range drones plus 23 cruise missiles and 7 ballistic missiles at Ukraine, while General Oleksandr Syrskyi said Russian forces carried out 619 attacks in 4 days along the front lines. At the same time, Ukraine kept pressing one of the most uncomfortable pressure points in the entire Russian system, which is, as some of you might have guessed, energy infrastructure. From refineries to ports to pipeline flows, everything. Then, just to make the picture even bigger, Vladimir Zelenskyy said Russia plans to open 4 ground control stations for long-range drones on the territory of Belarus. Kiev says it has irrefutable also evidence of Russian intelligence support to Iran. The European Commission delayed its April 15th proposal for a permanent ban on Russian oil imports. And Vladimir Putin signed a law allowing private security firms, pretty much citizens, to use firearms to defend critically important Russian energy facilities. Whew. In other words, this is not just another day of frontline attrition, because the battlefield, the drone war, the energy war, the sanctions debate, and the wider Russia and Iran, Belarus geopolitical layer all started feeding into each other at the same time. So the thesis for today's briefing is very simple. Russia may be trying to open the warmer, wetter phase of its campaign with bigger pressure from the sky and renewed pressure on the front lines. But Ukraine is not just sitting there absorbing all of it, because Kiev is trying to raise the cost of the war in 3 different ways at once. By using drones to hold the line more cheaply, by striking Russian energy infrastructure more aggressively, and by widening the diplomatic argument from "this is a regional war" to "this war is now connected to Belarus, Iran, oil markets, and Western strategic hesitation." And when you put all of this together, when you get in as much, what you get as a result is a much more interesting picture than just a usual shallow headline reading that one side attacked and the other side responded. Because the real question now is not only who advanced or who struck what, but which system is under more strain going into the next phase, potentially, of this entire war. Here's the unfortunately surprising part. The biggest thing in today's AP report is not simply the number of Russian drones, even though almost 400 quote-unquote, is already enough to get attention by itself. Because the more important part is what those strikes may be signaling about the ground war. According to AP, 4 people were reported dead and at least 35 were injured after Russian strikes on civilian areas, with 10 locations hit across the country, and then daylight-even strikes later injured 13 more people in Dnipro, including 3 children. While another strike hit an apartment block in central Lviv near the Polish border, where 2 people were reportedly severely injured. That alone would make this a major news day, but AP connected those strikes to what could be the beginning of the anticipated spring ground offensive, which is exactly why this matters more than just a standard overnight barrage. And then you get the frontline layer. Syrskyi said fierce fighting unfolded along the entire line of contact, and that Russia launched 619 attacks in just 4 days, while Ukrainian forces moved reinforcements to the threatened sectors. AP also noted that the Institute for the Study of War said Syrskyi's report supports its assessment that Russia's spring-summer offensive is now underway, and that Russia has moved more heavy equipment and troops to the front line since March 17th, almost 1 week ago. That does not mean Moscow suddenly has some magical breakthrough on its hands, because the same AP report also says that Russia still occupies only about 20% of Ukraine, and has historically struggled to convert attritional pressure into major urban captures. But it does also mean that the Kremlin is trying to create the impression of momentum again, just as the weather improves and international attention is partially diverted by the Iranian war. Now here is where most people go wrong. They hear spring offensive and instantly imagine some clean, fast, unstoppable battlefield surge, as if some kind of 2022 once again. All columns are about to sweep across the map, all this kind of stuff. But that is not exactly what reporting actually suggests. Nir Liman, a Ukrainian soldier with the call sign King, told AP that Russian assaults intensified and logistics routes were targeted. Yet Russian forces still failed to achieve a breakthrough, with Ukrainian units destroying advancing columns and inflicting losses on armored vehicles and personnel. Even his wording was very revealing, because he described the situation as tense but not critical, which is not the kind of language you use when the front lines are collapsing. So the opening picture, yes, it is serious. But it is serious and grinding, pressure, building systems systems war way. Not in a sudden, dramatic, one-day collapse, everything is forgotten, everything is lost kind of way. And that matters because it changes how you frame the next few weeks. If Russia is trying to intensify pressure through sheer volume, through almost 400 drones in one night, through 23 cruise missiles, 7 ballistic missiles, through 619 attacks in 4 days, then the war is becoming even more about sustainable exchange rates, sustainable defenses, sustainable logistics, and sustainable pressure. Which brings us directly to the next chapter, because one of the most revealing stories of the day is not about just geography at all, but about arithmetic. And that arithmetic may tell us way more about the direction of the war than any single map update. By the way, if you're a Patreon member, there is another GoPro combat footage I uploaded just recently, so please go ahead and watch it if you want, it's very interesting. And if you're not a member yet, please consider checking out our Patreon. There is 1 month free trial, so literally no cost to you, no commitment. The link is down below, thanks much, let's continue. In just a second I will reveal something most people overlook, and that is that wars often change not when one side says something dramatic, but when one side starts describing the conflict in brutally efficient numbers. Robert callsign Magyar Brody, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, said that the eliminating one Russian soldier cost approximately $878 in materials. And he also said that his forces are currently eliminating 400 Russians for every one Ukrainian. Questionable statistics, but, well, that's what he said. He further said that these strict safety protocols helped keep the overall casualty rate in his unit at only 1%, and that he insists on backup for every piece of equipment because of lessons learned from incidents in which he nearly himself died. Those claims were previously reported by Ukrainskaya Pravda as coming from an interview with The Economist, and even if outside observers should treat battlefield ratios carefully, because all wartime figures deserve caution, the strategic message is still very crystal clear. Ukraine is trying to turn drones into a very cost-efficient machine. This is exactly what changed everything in the war over the last 4 years. Russia still has advantages in manpower, in missile production, in the ability to throw metal at the problem, but Ukraine has increasingly responded by building a battlefield logic where relatively cheap systems can deny relatively expensive assaults. AP made the same point from another angle when it wrote that Ukraine has developed advanced drone technology to compensate for shortages of infantry. In other words, the question is no longer just how many troops each side has, but how many troops each side can effectively use under dense drone surveillance, drone strike pressure, and disrupted logistics. Once the battlefield becomes transparent from above, once everything is visible, and once low-cost systems start finding targets in mass, in bulk, every counterattack becomes way more expensive, every movement becomes more visible and more dangerous, and every tactical gain starts carrying a heavier, much heavier price tag. And this is where the story becomes more important than just one provocative quote. If Magyar is anywhere close to describing the real trend, then Ukraine is not merely improvising with drones anymore. It is industrializing a new battlefield model. That matters because Russia's traditional strength has always been its willingness and ability to absorb enormous costs over time. But that becomes way harder when the other side is finding much cheaper, 100 times cheaper options and more scalable ways to multiply defensive power. It also helps explain why Russia keeps escalating not only along the current front lines, but also from the sky. Because if drones are making ground assaults more punishing, then one response is to overload simply Ukrainian air defenses, stretch Ukrainian logistics, and force Kyiv to spend more resources defending cities far from the front lines. So when you connect those two chapters, a more complete picture emerges. Russia is trying to intensify both ground and air pressure at the same time, while Ukraine is trying to answer not by matching volume 1-for-1, which, well, obviously it cannot easily do, but at least by finding a better exchange rate. And once you start thinking about these exchange rates, once you start thinking about cost curves and pressure points, one target starts standing out above almost everything else inside Russia. And that target is energy. Because if Ukraine cannot outproduce Russia in every category, it can still try to hit the places where Russian output, exports, and budget stability are most exposed. That is where things get really interesting in our next chapter. Now here is the game changer. Reuters reported that Ukraine has increased attacks on Russian energy facilities in recent weeks as peace talks failed to make any meaningful progress. And when you look at the details, this is not some vague campaign against energy in the abstract. No. For example, the most recent Saratov refinery controlled by Rosneft was hit by a drone on March 21st, and its crude distillation unit has reportedly been shut down since the attack. In 2024, to be specific, that particular refinery processed 5.8 million metric tons of oil, representing 2.2% of Russia's total oil refining, for a single refinery. That alone is already significant, because Ukraine is not just striking random industrial targets, it is going after processing nodes with measurable national value. And that is not all. Reuters also reported that one Volgograd refinery owned by Lukoil was completely shut down on February 11th after drone attacks. One of the hit facilities was the primary oil processing unit CDU-1, with capacity of 18,600 tons per day, accounting for around 40% of the refinery's total. And then in 2024, Volgograd processed 13.7 million tons of oil. So now we're not talking about some symbolic nuances. We're talking about Ukraine repeatedly creating disruptions at facilities that matter to domestic refining and, by extension, to the broader stability of Russian energy flows and export capacity. Then Reuters moved from refineries to the transport layer, and this is where the story becomes even more strategic. The Baltic Sea ports of Ust-Luga and Primorsk resumed crude loadings on Monday and Tuesday after suspending operations due to drone attacks, while Transneft cut crude intake into its system by around 250,000 barrels per day after February 23rd Ukrainian drone strike on a pumping station serving major hubs and ports. Whew, this was a long sentence. So Ukraine is not only trying to damage refining capacity, it is also testing how vulnerable the movement of Russian oil is, from pipeline intake to maritime export nodes. That is a different kind of pressure, because it targets the arteries, not just the organs. And when a state starts to feel that kind of pressure, it reacts. Reuters reported that Putin signed a law on Tuesday allowing private security firms to use firearms to defend critically important energy facilities, expanding the range of weapons allowed for such protection. And I mean, what's even the purpose? Sounds useless and stupid if you ask me, allowing private citizens to carry guns to do exactly what? Try to shoot down drones with bullets, I don't know. But at the same time giving weapons to some imbeciles without any background checks or anything just so they can protect vital industries, I mean, surely going to end well for Russia and its regions, right? This may sound like a bureaucratic detail, but it is actually quite revealing, because governments do not casually broaden armed protection around critical infrastructure unless they believe that the threat has become serious enough to justify this new legal regime. The Kremlin is basically admitting, without saying it directly, that the energy war has moved from irritation to a little structural concern, at least. Here is the part that shocked me personally the most in today's briefing. This domestic Russian adjustment also tells you something about the war's geography. Ukrainian pressure is no longer confined to the frontline or even to purely military facilities. It is reaching into the Russian system in ways that force Moscow to reallocate security resources, rethink internal protection, and normalize a more obvious wartime narrative at home. That does not mean Ukraine can shut down the Russian economy by itself just like this, because Russia still has, unfortunately for the war, still has a large redundancy, alternative routes, and a massive state apparatus built around the energy sector. But it does mean, thankfully, that Ukraine keeps finding areas where relatively modest strikes can create outsized disruption. And once you see that, the next logical question is whether Russia will try to widen its own drone architecture to compensate. And the answer may be yes, with Belarus now entering the picture once again. Let's talk about in more details in our next chapter. Reuters reported that Zelenskyy, citing Ukraine's military intelligence service, said that Russia plans to open 4 ground control stations for long-range attack drones in Belarus. He also said Russia intends to keep using Belarusian territory and temporarily occupied Ukrainian territory to build those stations, and warned that there would be responses that will be felt. That's not a minor side note, because Belarus has always mattered less for what it says and more for what Moscow can do from its territory. If 4 ground control stations really are being prepared there, then Belarus is becoming not just a staging area or political satellite, but a more integrated operational platform for the drone war. And this matters for 3 reasons. First, it potentially expands launch and control flexibility for long-range attacks against Ukraine. Second, it forces Kyiv to think more broadly about the northern threat axis again, even if Belarusian troops themselves are not crossing the border. And third, it complicates the political fiction that Belarus is somehow distant to the war rather than function involved in it. I mean, it's not that I guess many people think about it this way anymore, but you get it. Zelenskyy even explicitly said that earlier in the war, Belarusian assistance had intensified the damage from Russian attacks until Ukraine took action against it. So from Kyiv's perspective, this is not just a theory, it is a pattern returning in a new form. But then the story gets even broader, because Reuters also reported that Ukraine says it has irrefutable evidence that Russia continues to provide intelligence to Iran. Zelenskyy said Russia is using its own intelligence and electronic capabilities, as well as some data obtained through cooperation with partners in the Middle East, and that this activity can only prolong the war in the region. In a separate Reuters report, Ukraine's permanent representative to the United Nations, Andriy Melnik, argued that Moscow's shipment of modernized drones to Iran means Russian drone production sites should be seen as legitimate military targets. And he said these modernized Iranian-designed Shahed drone systems make Russia Tehran's main accomplice in this conflict. This is where things take a fascinating turn, because for a long time people treated these theaters as separate. Ukraine was Ukraine, Middle East was Middle East, sanctions were one topic, energy was another topic, Belarus was just an occasional mention nobody cared about, and drone production was just a technical story. But that compartmentalized view is getting way harder to maintain. If Russia is helping Iran with intelligence, if modernized drone cooperation is flowing in both directions, if Belarus is becoming more useful for long-range Russian drone operations, and if the same global oil disruptions are now reshaping the Europeans' energy debate, then the war is not just expanding geographically, it is becoming strategically fused with other crises. And for Ukraine, that creates both danger and opportunity. The danger is obvious. The more crises merge together, the easier it is for Ukraine to get crowded out of the Western attention cycle. AP directly noted that the Iran war has already somewhat diverted international attention away from Ukraine. But the opportunity, thankfully, is also there. It's also obvious. Kyiv can now make the case that supporting Ukraine is not a charity event anymore, and not even only just about security of Eastern Europe, but also a part of a wider security contest involving drones, energy markets, Gulf stability, intelligence networks, and Europe's long-term vulnerability. That is a much bigger and better argument, and it leads perfectly into the next chapter, because Europe is now being forced to make decisions under exactly those conditions. Now, if all that did not surprise you, probably the next thing will. Reuters reported that the European Commission will no longer submit its legal proposal to permanently ban Russian oil imports on April 15th, as previously planned. And that the date was moved because of current geopolitical developments, with the Iran war disrupting global oil supply being primarily reason. So the proposal has not been cancelled, and one European official said it still will be published, but the delay tells you something very important. Even when Europe understands the strategic logic, the political and market timing can still make action harder. The details are very revealing as well. Reuters wrote that the original April 15 timing would have placed the proposal just 3 days after Hungary's parliamentary elections, and Viktor Orban remains strongly opposed to any such ban. At the same time, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said that this month that returning to Russian energy would be a strategic blunder, and that would make Europe way more vulnerable. That is basically Europe's dilemma in one sentence, literally. On paper, the answer is kinda obvious. Long-term dependence on Russian energy is very dangerous. But in real life, however, oil markets are tight, geopolitical shocks are multiplying, and the Union still contains governments that resist hard separation from Moscow. And here is why this matters for the war rather than just European policy. If Ukraine keeps striking Russian energy infrastructure, and if Russia keeps trying to adapt and defend those facilities more heavily, then the value of every European decision about Russian energy increases. Because from Moscow's perspective, the ideal outcome is not necessarily to fully restore pre-war normality, since, well, that is obviously gone a long time ago, but to at least preserve enough oil revenue, enough export continuity, and enough political hesitation in Europe to keep financing the war while waiting out Western fatigue. So every delay may be understandable in a narrow political sense, yes. Yet every delay also creates strategic breathing room. This next part is very crucial, so guys, please pay close attention. Europe's oil debate is no longer isolated from the battlefield. If Russian drones and missiles keep striking Ukrainian cities, if Belarus becomes a more active operational base, if Russia is deepening its ties with Iran, and if Ukraine is responding by targeting refineries, pumping stations, and ports, then energy policy becomes one of the most important parts of this war entire architecture. It's no longer just external discussions about economics. No, this is war itself. That is why this chapter belongs in the briefing, because it helps explain why battlefield developments, sanctions policy, and oil market timing now move together. And once that happens, the conflict stops looking like a collection of separate headlines and starts looking like one integrated contest over endurance. So, the biggest takeaway from today are pretty straightforward. Russia appears to be opening the next phase with a bigger aerial pressure and renewed offensive activity on the front lines. Ukraine is still trying to answer with drones and deeper strikes on Russia's energy system, and the wider map of the war now clearly includes Belarus, Iran, and Europe's unresolved energy dilemma. And that combination makes the coming period look way less like a pause and more like a harder, more connected stage of the conflict. So yeah guys, if you want more briefings like this, with the battlefield updates, the geopolitical layer, the economy, the sanctions, and a deeper strategic picture to put all these things together in one place, please consider subscribing to my channel and like this video. Don't forget about our Patreon, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe